substitute tonight. In fact, I never even planned to ever give this presentation. I just handed to Barbara when she went out the door, and if somebody doesn't show up, you've got something to fill in with. Now, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you understand me?
Yes.
Because I've lost a vocal cord and have some paralysis. I grew up on the west side of Mt Airy, Hill Street. My presentation's going to be a little different. My parents always discouraged me from afternoon and evening community activities. So I had to take a different approach. I had to have a different outlet for my energy. So you might call this presentation the natural history of Mt Airy. I divided it into 4 parts. Growing up around my grandparents and other older people, birding, lifelong hobby, the Hill Street Gang, and hunting in Mt Airy. Can you believe it? I hunted all over what's now Rising Ridge. It was my great-grandfather's farm. So as I said, I grew up on Hill Street. And of course, I grew up with my grandparents. They lived in the house next door. And I spent a lot of time with my grandparents when I was 4 and 5 years old. My grandfather, Runkles, who was pop to me, always had a garden every spring and summer. And every spring, he used to call Ollie Driver in to bring his team of mules to plow his garden. As a child, I soon learned the commands for mules. Whoa, haul, gee, so forth. And Pop had no outhouse back in the corner by the garden. I only ever used it in emergencies. It had a nice pile of soft corn cobs. But what got me was that the seat was too big for me. And hanging down on the seat over the pit, there were always hornets and wasps. I was always afraid one of them would sting me. But I was lucky. I managed to survive the emergencies. I mentioned perhaps chicken pen. There's a chicken pen off to the side where my grandfather raised chickens. And I used to sneak under one of the gates. There was a loose board that I could wiggle free and get under the gate and the pen. And my grandfather used to have this big long wire chicken catcher. And I'd pull it down and go in and try to catch the chickens. And of course, some of them were so tame they would eat out of my hand. But the thing I remember, I loved my grandfather's chicken mash that he kept in the chicken house. And he kept it in a huge metal container. I was just tall enough to push the lid up and reach in and grab a handful of mash. Well, one day I pushed the lid up and reached in. I pulled it out pretty quick, something bit my fingers. So I pulled myself up to look over the edge, and I was eyeball to eyeball with a big rat. time. We'd walk down Hood Street, and along the way, my Uncle Ari, Runkles, would join us. And I remember a particular occasion. They were knocking down the buildings between the old firehouse and the Flatiron building. And one of them was called the Roman Forum. It was basically cement. I remember that crane had this huge iron ball, and time again, it would hit that building and just bounce off. It took them some time to tear the building down. I remember another occasion when we sat down there and watched the paved Main Street for the first time with asphalt. You remember when it was concrete? It was the first time I ever saw one of those big asphalt layers come through. Never seen one before. And of course, in watching all this, we sat out in front of Mr. Topper's store on some crates. Later, when I was older, I used to go to town with my father on Friday evenings for the drawings. 8 o'clock sharp, held the drawings in front of Potomac Edison, which is on Park Avenue, right across from the Flatiron building. And we would walk down Hood Street and up Main Street, go all the way. We'd start an evening at the Mt Airy Bank, and we talked to Frank Conway, the president, Helen Glaze, one of the tellers. Pat was there later, and Harry Bellison. He was in charge of the savings and loan. He was the one that alerted the town to the fire on class night in 1925. That was the night it burned my grandfather's mill. After we saw Harry Bellison, we came up the street and stopped at the mill. And there my father would see Norman Etzler, Walter Spurrier. Norman Etzler used to go with my father on weekends to dances. And Walter Spurrier used to ride the old #1 fire truck until there was a bad accident out at Ridgeville. There's just a slight bend there now, but it was a really sharp bend with a stone wall. And the fire truck didn't make it around the bend and threw Walter off. And he was injured for life. Then after we stopped at the mill, we'd stop to see Doc Myers. And I'm going to tell on Doc Myers, but when my father was a young man during Prohibition, he used to go see Dr. Stanley Crable in the afternoon, Friday afternoon, and get a prescription for a 5th of whiskey. So then he'd go down to see Doc Myers. Doc Myers would fill it. And once we finished with Doc Myers, we went over to see Barbara's grandfather and Aunt Chloe. And there my father would get his weekend treat, plain oysters. And he'd always get me some peach-filled cookies. By that time, it was time for the drawing. So we'd go over for the drawing. I remember some evenings, the drawing, people would be standing out in Main Street and Park Avenue. It stopped traffic for a while. But anyway, after the drawing was over, my father to go see Chink Straw. He had the jewelry shop right there by the old hotel. And of course, my father and Chink grew up together. And I remember him telling about the time that Chink's father, B.W. Straw, was building a boat in his basement. And Chink and my father were helping him. And by the way, B.W. had a lot of patents, especially for the B&O Railroad. And they were talking about this time they built the boat in the basement. It was all built and they were ready to take it out. The basement door wasn't big enough. They had to shovel out the basement, put a new door in to get the boat out. And once they got the boat out, they took it down to Chesapeake Bay and put it out. There was a big ocean-going ship coming up the bay, and they started running circles around the ship with their speedboat. And they said that the captain came out and got his foghorn and called out to them, "Please, boys, please get out of my way." You see, back then, the smaller boat had the right of way. So at any rate, if there was time left and Izzy Wilkins' store was still open, my father couldn't see Izzy. And back when my father was a boy, when he'd come home from school and go by Wilkins, the store, Izzy and his brother would give my father, they were both Jewish, they'd give my father the money to go over to Mr. Bradley's store and buy a pork loin. And my father then would meet him back on the railroad tracks where they'd have a fire going and they'd have a pork roast. And then my father lived out at Ridgeville behind where Mr. Tyre is now. So he'd gone home now after they had had their feast.
So that happened about every week?
Not every week, just once in a while.
Okay.
Then the other story I remember back to Chink's was that his wife Thelma, she was in the last car across Jug Bridge heading east when it fell. She could hear it crumbling behind her. And if you know Jug Bridge is the old bridge that went across the Monocacy River, you can still see the jug on old 144 East Patrick Street. It was fun to hear my father and his buddies reminisce as a kid. It was fun. My grandmother Runkles, whom we all called Mom Addie, fixed dinner for the family on Sunday afternoons. She'd go out and catch a couple of pops chickens and cut their heads off. She then set them down on the ground to let them run across the yard for me to catch. I'd come back to her a bloody mess. And then to top it off, she'd have a pan of scalding water. She'd scald the chickens, and together we'd pluck them. I'd come home in the house to my mother, covered with feathers and blood, and say the least, she wasn't happy with me and Mom Maddie. But I could still see those chickens flying off ahead of us. Mt Airy was truly a rural town. Between Hill Street, Main Street, I remember horses, cows, pigs, chickens, rabbits. We had it all in town in those days. Because I liked to garden with my grandfather, I somehow, when I was young, ended up in a newly formed junior garden club with 2 other boys and a bunch of girls. I stayed in it long enough to win some first prizes at flower shows. But I had a secret weapon. My next door neighbor, Aunt Faye Watkins. I don't think many people know it, but she was judge of international flower shows. She traveled over the world. One day I happened to ask her, she had been over to the Netherlands. And I said, Aunt Faye, what'd you go over there for? I said, I judged the international flower show. So, when time for a flower show in Mt Airy, I'd go back to my little flower bed behind the garden and pick out some plants and take them over to Aunt Faye. And she'd pick out the best ones. Not only that, she'd take them to the flower show for me and put them on display. First prize was a cinch.
Sorry, was that Asa Watkins' wife?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was. My father got me out of the garden club. I was 12 years old, and I was old enough to go to work. So he got me a job as assistant janitor down at Calvary Methodist Church. And I remember 2 things in particular. One of my first jobs was to wash and wax the floors in what was the new education wing. So I washed and waxed the floors. And while I was at it, I did a little extra. I washed and waxed the steps.
Oh.
You can imagine. People started to slip on the steps the following Sunday morning. Needless to say, my father, who was chairman of the trustees, and Mr. Etzler were a little aggravated with me. And by the way, Mr. Etzler was Norman Etzler's father. The other thing that I remember, one Sunday Mr. Etzler was going away. And he asked me to ring the church bell at 9:15. What an honor. Nobody ever rang that bell with Mr. Etzler. So, Sunday morning came. I looked at the kitchen clock and I set my watch exactly at that kitchen clock. And I went down to the church and precisely at 9:15, I rang the bell. After church, Barbara's grandfather, Mr. Lindsay Browning, came up to me. Ronnie, I heard you rang the bell this morning. You rang it a minute late. What in the world? I was so dejected. Finally, Mr. Etzler came back and he said, I talked to Mr. Browning. He told me what happened. I said, Ronnie, I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you. before I go down to church to ring the bell, I always go down to the station, the railroad station, to set my watch. Mt Airy was still a railroad town. Mt Airy was rural, Mt Airy was railroad. Even our school colors reflected the B&O Railroad. Okay, shift gears a little bit. This section I called a lifelong hobby. Mom and Daddy grew up in where you town historians call it Dorsey's Mill. My great-great-grandfather, Watkins, had bought it from Dorsey, if I remember right, and then he gave it over to his son-in-law, my grandmother's father. He was a Wilson, and my grandmother used to tell me that Alexander Wilson was a great-great-uncle. He was the father of American ornithology. So I had it in my genes to like birds. She taught me a simple way to describe birds. I was only 4 and 5 years old, but I'd go out and I'd run around, watch birds, find a bird I couldn't identify, come back to my grandmother, we'd sit and go through the bird book until we found it. And by the time I was 5 years old, I could name then what were all common birds in Mt Airy. And when I was a child, Mt Airy had a lot of birds that we don't have today. I remember there was a big old pear tree outside my bedroom window. In the evening, I'd watch Baltimore Orioles build their nest and feed their young. One year, what were red-headed woodpeckers, not these red-bellied woodpeckers that we see now, but the real red-headed woodpeckers built their nest, one of the big vertical limbs. I remember a Baltimore Oriole in her backyard walnut trees. Took a little stick about that long in its bill, and it would pry the rotten shell off the outer edge of the walnuts to get the larvae underneath. This is one first time witnessing a bird using a tool. We had bluebirds right in our backyard fence post. I watch them. And then Aunt Faye had this botanical garden and flower beds. And I remember one winter, these funny birds with crossed bills came to her larch and balsam trees. These were red and white-winged crossbills. They came down from the boreal forest in Canada when food was scarce. I remember one summer seeing in her apple tree this funny bird that size of a robin with a long tail. And when it flew away, its tail feathers went back and forth like a pair of scissors. Scissor tail flycatcher from the Gulf states. In late summer, birds are like young adults. Young birds, like young adults, they tend to roam. So there were all kinds of birds here at one time. And finally, my brother we called him Beaver, Marion, brought home a Martin box that he had made in school, in shop class. My father put it up. Something's here. See, that's a little better. They brought this bird box, Martin box home, put it up outside of our kitchen window. Well, we got Martins. And in the morning, they were noisy. My aunt and uncle came up from Florida, and after the first night, first morning, they left and went out to Class's parents. They couldn't stand the noise from the Martin box. But after a while, my father and I built another box, and we put that on back in the yard. So we had 2 Martin boxes, and by the end of summer, we'd have 75 or more Martins around. And I'll never forget, they always left an old male to guard the boxes during the day as the others went out to forage for the young. And that old Martin used to perch on the antenna top of our house. It would come off that antenna when I was on the swing. My father, we had 2 big walnut trees, English walnut trees, in our backyard. And my father put up a swing, single seat swing for me. So I'd be swinging, this old Martin would come down under the walnut tree, pass beside the chain in my face, and brush his wing across my cheek. As time went on, I thought, the next time he comes, I can catch him. I was ready. He came on. I reached out for him. It was my first time ever airborne. Needless to say, it was a hard landing on my backside. I never tried to catch him again. I flew thousands of miles with Nima, sometimes with Mary's husband, and I never had a landing ever again as hard as that one. And the evening after supper, I'd walk out across the yard, and one of the Martins, sure enough, would dive bomb me. Game on. I get my trusty water pistol loaded up. We had a stand of small evergreens in the backyard. That was my World War II battleship. Of course, I was a gunner. And those Martins would come in V formations, and they'd peel off to strafe my battleship. And sure enough, I'd fire away. The action would be fast and furious, and I seldom missed. But the truth of it was, I wasn't a good shot. They were just agile enough in their flight to line up with a stream of water. And that's the way they got a drink. And this would go on until they all had their fill. And then game was over. I never forget one evening when I was in my sophomore year of high school. My father came to me and said, Ronnie, where do you want to go to school and what do you want to study? And right away, I said, I want to go to Cornell University and I want to study ornithology, birds, with Dr. Arthur A. Allen. My father exploded. No son of mine is going to college to study birds. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. Needless to say, my dreams were shattered. So some years passed. I just started to work for NEMA, and 3 books came in the mail. They were all entitled Ruffed Grouse. I had written major part of those books. So I took one of them home to my father. We had hunted ruffed grouse together when I was a kid. And I gave it to my father, and I said, "Do you remember the night you shattered my dream?" We had a good laugh about it. But from these early childhood experiences and others with birds, it left me with a lifelong hobby. I obtained a master's permit from the U.S. Department of Interior to capture and mark wild birds. We call it today bird banding. Over 25 years of banding on weekends, I caught several thousand birds. It also gave me an opportunity to do research and study at the U.S. Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institute. And there I met numerous experts in ornithology from all over the world. For my banding and research, I contributed a lot of data and information for published articles. I just passed along information to others, and yeah, they acknowledged me in some of the major journals. But the hobby was enjoyable and very rewarding. It all started in Mt Airy. Now let me switch. It's time for me to stop.
Can you summarize it real quick? What else you have?
No.
Oh.
You all can go. Hey, Barb can fill in with us another evening when somebody can't make it. How about that?
Well, we don't have too many more to go.
That's okay.
Hey, Ronnie, you forgot to tell the story about birds and grease, if I remember right.
What?
Birds and grease?
English class, Mrs. Miller.
Oh, a Parthenon.
Yeah, you got it.
Can't forget that, buddy. That's one of life's stories.
Share that.
I remember making some comment in the class
Mrs. Miller is
that I could just see somebody shooting crows off the Parthenon. The class started to erupt, and Ms. Miller got all upset with me.
The rest of us thought it was funny, but she didn't. Was Carol Easy involved with that too? I don't even remember Rodney shooting
Yep.
crows off the bar.
It was just Ronnie.
But Margaret Miller and I didn't always get along. I remember the first day, she pulled me aside. She said, "Ronnie, if you ever call me Maggie, you'll never finish high school." And you know, I didn't know. I never thought of that. Went home to my father. He got to laughing. Said we always called her Maggie. She obviously didn't like it. She obviously knew. But anyway,